Chinese demand for our biggest export, iron ore, may be volatile, but Chinese tourists can't get enough of Australia. A record 1.5 million Chinese tourists visited our shores over the year to May. They're also spending in record numbers. But there are claims the Australian tourism industry may not be making the most of the boom. Sue Lannon has more.
It's Gangnam style on the Sydney Harbour Bridge as companies like Bridge Climb offer a Mandarin climb for Chinese tourists. Visiting the Sydney Opera House is also a favourite pastime for Chinese tour groups. They also have eyes for shopping, especially for luxury brands, with the average Chinese tourist spending more than $2,000 on retail therapy each visit.
UGG and sneakers or clothes or bags.
UGG is what Chinese people call Ugg boots, which are a hit with Asian tourists.
In China, even if the Ugg boot manufacturer is distributing in China, the Chinese consumers worry that they're not really getting the real Ugg boot. But if they come to Australia and buy it, they feel like they can get the authentic stuff.
But it seems a lot of Australian businesses are in the dark about what Chinese tourists want. Most Chinese tourists come to Australia at Chinese New Year in February, mid-year during the Chinese school holidays and at Christmas time. And that's when they spend the most. China consultant CT Johnson says this Ugg boot shop at Sydney's Circular Quay is doing all the right things.
So there's a couple of things here that are really great signals for a Chinese person who wants to spend money. Union Pay, right, which is the #1 credit card in China. We have some Chinese writing here that just says, "Welcome to Sydney."
But as Chinese tourists now outnumber Kiwis as our biggest tourist market, he says not all retailers are getting it right.
So it's all Western credit cards that are accepted. There's no Union Pay accepted here. There's no Chinese signs. There's nothing that tells me that they're friendly to me as a Chinese tourist and that make me want to come into this store.
Tourism Australia boss John O'Sullivan disagrees with the criticisms.
To actually singularly say because we don't have every shop in Sydney doesn't have a Mandarin speaker behind the counter or doesn't have a Mandarin sign, all of a sudden this market's going to decline, it's a bit erroneous and quite simplistic.
But the tourists we spoke to want to see more Mandarin speakers.
My mother needs some people who can speak Chinese.
CT Johnson says Chinese tourists spend an average of $8,000 per visit, more than tourists from the UK and the US.
There is absolutely no doubt that Australian tourist industries, that Australian retailers, hotels and restaurants could be earning much more from Chinese tourists than they're doing today. They are only doing a middling job of serving that sector.
Cruise ships like these on Sydney Harbour are also popular with Chinese tourists during peak periods. Over the past year, more than 1 million Chinese tourists have visited Australia and they've spent around $9 billion. But some travel companies say there's not enough services like cruise ships or hotel rooms to meet the demand.
The very few hotels is not enough. The hotel is not enough, especially in the Chinese New Year and the Chinese summer holidays.
The language barrier also means a lot of Chinese tourists prefer to use Chinese Australian tour companies like Grand City Tours. The Tourism Australia boss believes the Australian travel industry is doing enough to attract Chinese tourists.
The tourism industry already does a lot of work in this particular space about getting the industry to be Chinese ready, to be welcoming, to make that experience better for that Chinese visitor, to increase repeat visitation.
Tourism Australia's strategic plan, China 2020, aims to increase spending by Chinese tourists to $13 billion annually by knowing the customer. Part of that is helping local firms learn about China.
We recently took 100 businesses up into the Chinese market as part of Australia Week in China to give them an education about the Chinese trade, about the Chinese consumer.
It's a group of happy customers for Grand City Tours, but the risk is some may not come back for a return trip if Australia doesn't lift its game.